in many respects, our country's founding technically was 1776.
Yeah.
But it really was the laws that came out of Reconstruction, because the 14th Amendment is like the bedrock of every, not every, but the majority of Supreme Court cases that we hear center around.
Is this like the Akhil Amar second founding argument?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
This is, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments that came out of Reconstruction, and all of the stuff like public school funding.
Yep. It's wild. Yeah.
I mean, you never hear, they all say, like, people didn't know this, but Abraham Lincoln was a Republican. What people really don't know is that all of the sort of bedrock progressive ideas that we have in our society, now I don't know if all, frankly,
but a ton of them.
Ton of them, in terms of like what society is supposed to provide for its citizens, comes from that era, comes from Republicans, radical Republicans. All right, so with that,
Marx was literally published in one of the main Republican newspapers.
Yeah.
Like, that's just truth.
and so people should know, at that time, the vice president did not run on the same ticket as the president.
Right.
So Abraham Lincoln, radical Republican, or Republican, maybe he wasn't a radical. Republican gets elected with a Democrat, Andrew Johnson.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, and Johnson was,
he was a Democrat. And
he had been a Southern Democrat, but it was literally like, there's so much about this is funny, like politically, if you sort of follow elections now, because they picked him to balance the ticket.
Right.
Because he was a strongly anti-war, poor Southern white conservative. So he was, strongly pro-war, strongly pro the Civil War. Strongly pro the Civil War and against secession. So he was to balance the ticket. So so Lincoln like runs with a guy who he doesn't actually agree with on a ton, just to like for electoral purposes.
And then of course Lincoln gets assassinated. Johnson becomes the president. He now has a Senate and Congress that is a House that is largely at odds with him, and certainly at odds with him in terms of what they want to do with Reconstruction.
Yeah.
And so take it from there, because then you dove into sort of the impeachment process and the thinking. He ends up not being convicted in the Senate by one vote, right? And so, all right, so tell us more.
So I do want to say that a lot of this, I read Barbara Wineapple, a great writer. She has a book, The Impeachers, which like you, I found myself completely fascinated by that era like more and more. And then you read about it, and you read like Thaddeus Stevens, who was one of the leading radical Republicans of the time, and you're like, my God, he's so modern. He doesn't seem ancient. His ideas seem so modern.
Yep.
They were trying to create basically a multiracial democracy in, right after the Civil War. And they came damn close to succeeding. So Congress knows that they don't, at first they think Johnson might be on their side, but he just starts basically a campaign to put the pre-Civil War white governments back in charge of all these southern states. So Congress has a majority of Republicans, in part because the southern states have no representation in Congress right now. The slave states are not being allowed to send people to Congress because their governments had just committed treason. So Johnson just wants to like, let's say he's like, let's just get back to normal. He's the candidate of, I just want to get back to normal. So we're going to have, all of them are going to reestablish their governments. And then the radical Republicans in Congress basically like watching him try to do this. It's crazy too, because they're out of session. It used to, you had to arrive in Congress by rail and by stagecoach back then. They're out of session for months after Lincoln's assassination, and Johnson is just sort of doing whatever he wants without oversight. So when they finally get back in session,
we should also say that Johnson seems to be a bit of a lunatic.
He is a lunatic, yeah.
Right.
And he gets crazier later on too, because what happened is that Congress then passes congressional reconstruction, which is basically like the president has been trying to forgive all these Confederates and put them back in charge, and Congress is like, all right, no, we're going to keep the military. The military is occupying the former Confederacy. The military will be in charge of these states. The military will force them to write new constitutions that will allow black men to vote, and then and only then will we admit their representatives back to Congress. Then Johnson, who was sort of unstable at the time, people accused him of being a drunk, although I think Wineapple says he probably just drank about as much as a normal person back then.
Which was quite a bit.
Which was a lot.
Right.
He starts holding what amount to Trumpian rallies. He drags Ulysses S. Grant, who's a war hero and one of America's like favorite people, and who was in the cabinet, and Charles Staunton, the Secretary of War. He drags them with him, and they are in the cabinet, so they sort of have to go with them on this insane tour around the country, where this is where they're not Trumpian rallies, because anyone can just show up to these presidential events and heckle the president. So people were like, we want Grant. You are a bad man. Like people are just shouting that, like, we want Grant. They're shouting at the president. And he's just getting angrier and angrier. And he starts saying stuff like, all the radical Republicans in Congress are like treasonous. They're against me. Yeah, exactly.
No angels.
They're no angels.
Angels.
And like,
put up my portrait.
He even starts doing the equivalent of like, people were sending him letters being like, you should lock Thaddeus Stevens up. And he's like, you know what? My people are looking into it,
2 weeks. We'll let you know in 2 weeks.
So he, and this sort of like, culminates in, so Charles Stanton, Secretary of War, was a Lincoln holdover. No radical, like all these people. It's interesting too, because you have these people who didn't actually particularly associate themselves with the radicals and were maybe even embarrassed by the radicals, but they just felt they had a sense of duty, that the radicals were more right than Johnson. So Johnson keeps insisting that that his War Department go around Congress and not enforce Reconstruction, basically. And then when Congress sort of notices what's going on, and they pass a law that basically says Johnson cannot fire a cabinet member without Senate approval. And then, this is what leads to the impeachment. So Johnson tries to fire the Secretary of War, and then that's what leads to impeachment. And it has been remembered in history as this very trivial and silly thing, which is sort of the thing that's enraging, that Congress passed this dubiously constitutional law that says the president can't fire someone in his cabinet. He fired someone in his cabinet. Congress impeached him. It failed in the Senate. And it's cast as like sort of small and petty. Or even worse, the Lost Cause people cast it as horrible radicals persecuting a good president or something like that.
Right, and Lost Cause is sort of the myth that came up in the wake of the Civil War to sort of justify. It romanticized
the Confederacy in the Old South.
In the Old South, and that they were, it wasn't about slavery. It was just about, was a myriad of things, but we don't need to go into that. Just so people...
Yeah. So, but impeachment is like, the impeachment was, on the letter of the law of him firing his Secretary of War, but Thaddeus Stevens added 2 more articles to it that were basically like cast the entire thing. Like here's every way he's been lawless, every way he has incited violence. There was mass anti-black violence across the South at the time that Republicans were convinced the president was tacitly approving of.
Huge.
Yeah.
In
New Orleans,
what the name of there was a massive slaughter of like at least 150 black people, and the KKK was resurging at this time.
Yeah.
And I can't remember what the name of it is. The Haymarket, or not the Hay. I can't remember.
But,
I'm sorry.
And the KKK was treated too. The KKK was treated as almost a myth at the time. This was the creation of the KKK, and it was out there killing people. And if you said that in Washington, you were like, people were like, it's conspiracy theories, But like that was being said by people who were supporting the birth of the KKK. Right. So anyway, it was
when he supported it, was it the rhetoric, or was there actual like material connections between him and those forces?
I don't think that it was mostly with Johnson. It was mostly just the rhetoric. I don't think there's evidence he was materially supporting the KKK.
Well, he was materially supporting it insofar as he was inhibiting the ability of the radical Republicans for controlling what was going on in the states.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so it was less I'm contributing to it, more like I'm creating a context in which it can grow.
Yeah.
What I meant is, and so not just a
there were other politicians.
A policy one.
I'm forgetting exactly who, but I think one of his lawyers, like, because he hired very good lawyers to defend himself from impeachment. I think one of his lawyers, like, afterwards went on to become a sort of high up member of the KKK. But so he was surrounded by people who were sort of in favor of this. But yeah, and so impeachment was, again, like, it was sort of what they felt they had to do to stop an out of control president, and then they lost very narrowly in the Senate. And Wineapple argues that in part because of one of the senators who actually bribed with a job and jobs for his friends.
And my understanding is that there was also some question as to whether that, I mean, I've heard the reason why, and I hadn't heard the bribery, although that doesn't surprise me at all. But that part of it was also like, there was also a feeling of, we're going to beat him anyway with Grant.
Exactly.
In 6 to 8 months.
Yeah.
I mean, it was in the
It was
last-
an election year. That's the other, that's what's like, you get deja vu reading this stuff because they were like, they had been prosecuting the case like in the House, and then they brought it to the Senate, and then it became a much more sort of lawyerly argument rather than a moral one, and much more legalistic. And then the Republicans who were less radical were sort of like, it's an election year. Grant's going to be the next president. Johnson's not going to win. Like, let's just get this over with and move on.
I mean, and the answer is probably all of those things that led to it.
Yeah.
Like, it's, but then, as Paul Wolfowitz said, it was the one thing we could all agree on.
Yeah.
And we all had our own reasons for the war.
And then on the way, but then like here's like the lesson there is like with his lame duck power, the last thing Johnson does is issue a blanket pardon for the entire Confederacy, for every Confederate officer, like even up to Jefferson Davis. Just
I think there was one person from the Confederacy who went to jail.
Yeah.
I can't remember who it was.
And like in the immediate aftermath of the war ending, people expected and demanded that the leaders of the Confederacy be put on trial.
Right.
Like they wanted them punished. And then within just like a few short years, like that's
turn the page.
Turn the page. Let's move on.
It's not like we're going to be living with the implications of this for
I mean,
what's time is it now? Until Friday, 12:11 p.m. In 2019.
Yeah.
And so, what are the big takeaway was just that one of the takeaways that I took was that you don't look at the specific infraction that they're impeaching him for. You look at the energy behind the impeachment and what is the agenda, because it is a political process. And the radical Republicans wanted to get him out of the way because he was dramatically inhibiting the ability to reshape America in the way that, certainly from our eyes today, it should have been.
Yep.
And these guys had a lot of foresight, and also they had just defeated these people in war, and that was, that's.
I think that was that. Yeah, I think that was especially like they were especially disheartened because they had just beaten them and expected with Lincoln continuing to be president that they would not necessarily get everything they wanted, but that.
There would be some material and thoughtful change as opposed to sort of like it being an adversarial, more adversarial process, I guess.
Yeah.
And so the metaphor today is that the Democrats are being far too timid in this. Is that it?
I mean, and I think.
Like they're just trying to get it over with, as if it's like some type of burden, as opposed to it is an arrow in the quiver of politics.
Yes.
And certainly the Republicans have used it that way.
Well, yeah.
And there is, the idea, I don't know, there's something about this that like, when the Democrats look back and go like, it hurt Bill Clinton. I mean, or it hurt the Republicans.
It hurt the Republicans too.
It's like, you remember the old Batman show where like the structure of the show was always the same. Batman would get captured, the evil villain would try and kill him, but some fluke, some deus ex machina would stop it, right?
Yeah.
And my attitude was always like, all right, if we have to accept that you need to kill him in a very dramatic fashion that opens the door for potential failure, why not just do it again? Like the chances of like lightning striking twice.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
Like this time, just leave the guard in the room.
Right.
And then do the same thing. You already have the Shark Tank.
Right.
You already have the crane to hold them.
Right.
Like the Democrats, like they don't see that there's a different scenario that happened with Clinton.
Right.
And I think, part of it is there's also on the left a certain amount of skepticism about impeachment, which I think is one of the things I liked about your piece was like these radicals knew that impeachment was a vehicle to provide material difference in terms of governing.
Yeah. And it was, it was the first, they sort of invented the procedure as they went along. And there was at the time a sort of understanding that I think it was interesting that Johnson was furious that he was being impeached, but he didn't actually consider it illegitimate that he was being impeached. Like, he considered sort of the actions of Congress to be usurping his power in a lot of areas, but it was just sort of taken as a given that Congress had the power to do this to him. That was interesting to me. And then one conclusion I sort of came to when I read some stuff from the 20th century, and especially a little bit of stuff around the time of Nixon, was that one of the lessons of that failure was, I think, incorrect. And I think the lesson was that the Constitution makes it incredibly difficult to remove a president, and so therefore it should be incredibly difficult to remove a president. I think that at the time it was understood that the difficulty was sort of almost an accidental creation of this process, but it was supposed to be much more straightforward if you have a president who is doing crimes all the time.
And it also it seems like more. It's listening to you. It seems more like in parliamentary systems, just like you have a vote of no confidence. Like, it doesn't necessarily need to be the most melodramatic thing either. It's just be like,
I mean,
this isn't working out.
It's supposed to be prosecuted like a crime,
right?
But
it could be used a little bit more liberally.
Well, it's an argument.
Say, like, it's an argument.
It's an argument that comes with potential political costs for somebody who brings it, like in any other situation.
Yeah.
If you're wrong, and I don't know. I find I mean, I can understand the and I'm thinking of the left broadly, because I know why the right has a problem with it, because they're doing politics too. But in terms of the left, and I don't mean like the resistance left, I mean like the left.
The left that is skeptical of this.
Yes. It seems to me it's just bizarre, because on some level that's like a process argument.
Yeah.
Like, it's like,
totally,
it's ignoring.
When I read your piece, though, as somebody who's maybe a little bit more in that left vein, I think what it occurred to me, and I skimmed it. I'm going to read all of it, but listening to you now is that if it really is delineated as a political process that doesn't have to be so narrowly defined. I'm not saying they would do this, but this opens the conversation of like, well, why can't you impeach Donald Trump for having concentration camps as an example?
Yeah,
you could.
And I know, and I mean, and that would certainly be, I mean, look, anybody who would object to that would, clearly just not be on the left.
think that's
fact, right?
I would hope that you would. I would say if I have skepticism about the current process, it is that they are
too narrowly tailored.
Too narrowly tailored.
Yes, they're too reluctant to do it.
They are too.
They're too reluctant, and they're too afraid of their own shadow in this respect. There is a whole host of things, and here's the thing: the process that they've set up is set up in that way. I mean, this investigation that we've seen, and people should be very clear on this. This investigation started September 9th.
Yes.
And it was because specifically over this topic. It's why on September 11th he released the money, because 2 days earlier the Congress had started to investigate it.
Yes.
And that has not been communicated to people, because there are 4 other committees that have ongoing investigations that are going to go back to the Judiciary Committee to form the articles of impeachment. When they're done here, and I have the committees written here. When they're done here, they're going to send their findings essentially to the Judiciary Committee, and then the Judiciary Committee will have perhaps a little bit more sort of like, I don't know, quasi-process things, and will then draft the articles of impeachment based upon this. But there are the financial services, the foreign affairs, oversight and ways and means also have investigations that could look just like this, except for it's about some guy in the IRS, quashing attempts to look at investigations or emoluments or I think Turkey or other stuff.
I think they have. I mean, to me, I know they are investigating this stuff. But to me, it feels a little bit like they finally looked under a rock, and they were like, oh, like, what's under here? That's terrible. And they're in a sea of rocks. Yeah. And they're like, well, all we need is here. Like, we don't need to look under.
I mean, I'm of two minds on some level, because there is a quality of like, we got Al Capone on tax cheating, exactly, and he went down, and that's the material benefit of this argument, which is like, if you agree that Chicago's safer without Al Capone, or shooting people on the streets. You don't say like, well, that tax thing is a little bit.
Are you going to look into the racketeering or the?
Well, I think to would you like me to play devil's advocate for those people for a second? I think what they're saying is that if you know that the tax case against Al Capone is not going to lead to a conviction,
then
right? And that also some of the accumulation of evidence to get it is going to empower overzealous IRS prosecutors or whatever to go after other people in the same fashion, then that's more what the argument is, right? Like, when, as an example, when I think it was Vidman said, and this did cause me concern when he said the president is undermining U.S. foreign policy, right? And the point with Trump is obviously that he's manipulating it for his own personal interest, and that's why we're here. So there's no debate about that. But that frame is problematic because ultimately the president generates U.S. foreign policy.
This is
the same argumentation will be used against somebody who actually just tries to change U.S. foreign policy.
This is what was so great about Fiona Hill's testimony.
Yeah.
Is that very moment, and here's a good time to play that clip. And then we'll get back to the broader point.